Meredith, we are ready for you.
Hey, look, I'm even unmuted. Excellent. Hey, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us late into the morning here. I know for those of you that, work, probably spend a lot of time working outside, this is probably a long time to be staring at a computer screen. So I appreciate you guys hanging in there with us. We'll try to make this kind of fun and nice pictures and things like that, not too hard on you. I do want to start off by saying, Katie, I'm a little disappointed that you turned off the alarm because I really thought that'd be a great way to bring me in with that great alarm, but that's okay. I'll live without it. Also, thanks to everybody that has spoken this morning. It's really great to just hear other professionals talk and what they deal with on a daily basis. Hearing Daniel talk, I'm a certified arborist myself, and I've been there going out and talking to your clients and trying to explain, like, yeah, I don't know what's wrong with the tree, but it's not happy, and it puts you in a hard spot sometimes. So it's good to commiserate with your peers. So today, well, before I start, actually, Denise always likes us to talk a little bit about how we got where we are. So how I got to be the garden center coordinator for the Zilker Botanical Garden here in Austin. And just so you know what that means is basically I'm in charge of the grounds and the horticulture staff here at the Botanical Garden. I actually started in the plant business in March of 1993 when I moved to Austin from Atlanta. I needed a job, and there was a little garden shop that needed a water boy, and that's what I did for the first 6 months, is dragged a hose around every day and watered plants. But I found it was something that I really liked. I really enjoyed learning about plants and being with the plants and things like that. So it definitely became a career for me. I just realized I didn't have my video on either. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about our principles of landscape design. I have listed 8 principles. That is a random number. If you look up principles of landscape design, you will find that there are a list of 6 and lists of 7 and lists of 12. It's kind of an arbitrary number. But one of the things I really want to point out, these are not rules of landscape design. These are not laws of landscape design. These are principles. So you're going to be following different ones in different ways. And, you're going to hear me say things and you're going to be like, well, wait a minute, that kind of contradicts something he already said. You're also going to hear me, say the same thing kind of in several different ways. And you're like, well, that's kind of the same thing. Because all these things kind of work together. And these are all kind of things you want to keep in your mind as you're working on a landscape design. So let's jump in with our 8 principles. And those would be unity, balance, contrast and harmony, color, transition, line, proportion, and simplicity. So we'll start out with unity. So unity is basically a function of repetition and consistency within your design. So unity is expressed through one core element, and harmony is created by the components that you use around that core element. One thing I like to think of with this, you want to create a theme for the garden. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to give your garden a name. So for example, Beverly's Butterfly Wonderland or something like that. It kind of, in a way, like gives you a mission statement. And it gives you, some ideas to kind of keep in the back of your mind at all times while you're designing. Don't use backyard paradise, because that's what everybody wants, is a backyard paradise. Come up with something that's pretty specific and something that really does, let you know what it is that you're out to do. Repetition and consistency within your materials is very important, I think. That's not to mean that you can only use one kind of stone, or you can only use stone instead of wood, or you can only use metal. But, again, you want to make sure you're trying to avoid too many different types of materials that can get very cluttered. Your lines and curves, that creates the flow of your garden. So make sure those are working together, and that it all kind of has a good flow and goes together. The surfaces when you're within the garden, are you using all of them? We're not just when you're designing on paper, you might be working in 2 dimensions, but life is 3-dimensional. So are we using height? Are we using the vertical surfaces that we have to draw all this stuff together, the walls of the house, things of that nature? Size is a very important thing, I think, to try to keep some consistency within. Obviously, you're going to have different sizes, big trees, small shrubs, little tiny perennials, but trying to keep all of those layers kind of in the same size range and keep everything so that it has a consistent look to it. Texture, shapes, forms of plants, those are also ways you can bring in that repetition and consistency. Focal points, have a few bold focal points, but also some subtle focal points. Like in these slides here, I personally think this planter is a little small, but this planter, it would be a bold focal point with the front door versus, there's kind of a subtle focal point down at the end of this path here that makes you think, gosh, what's down there? What do I want to see when I get down there? Color is a great way to get in repetition and consistency. Pick a few colors, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, but repeat those things over again. And, from the old adage, instead of asking how, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? Ask, how does your garden flow? How does this garden feel? How do you transition from one area to another? These are very, very important things to keep in mind when you're looking. And here's some other examples of some unity and harmony in gardens. You'll see things like colors repeated. This is quite a large garden, but you're seeing colors repeated. You're seeing vertical elements repeated. Not just colorful flowers, but colorful foliage, these purples that are repeated a couple of times. You've got curved beds, curved paths that kind of draw all this together. In the smaller example, again, you've got a little path and there's some things that really stand out, like the big rocks, but then there's other little things like, gosh, what's behind that little guy right there? Really interesting psychological things that keep you interested in the garden. So next up, as a core principle, would be balance, which is simply equality. You want to make sure that your landscape designs and your landscape have a good balance. Now, there's 2 types of balance. There's symmetrical balance, which is kind of the mirror image idea that everything is perfectly balanced. This can be very striking and very impressive, but also quite risky, which I'll talk about in a second. And it tends to be used more in a formal setting, and to some extent these days in the more modern landscapes. That's where you would see this kind of balance used. Most of us are probably going to work more with asymmetrical balance, which is where we're not looking for this mirror image, but we do want to make sure, kind of along the lines of consistency and repetition, that we're balanced with our colors. We don't have all one color on one side and all one color on the other. Our forms are balanced. Textures, are consistent within the ideas that we're using. Think a lot about like scale and weight. So, for example, if you have a large bed on one side and a smaller bed on the other, do they have kind of equal weight? Yeah, the bigger bed's going to have bigger plants and it's going to be larger, but do they kind of carry the same sort of gravitas even though the other one is smaller? And then a really important thing to keep in mind is your empty space versus your filled space. You don't want to fill all your space. It's kind of the yin yang. If you fill every square inch, then you're really not going to be able to appreciate stuff you do have. Leave some open space so you can appreciate that. But again, trying to keep that balanced. Looking at some of these pictures, I really like this picture here at the top because this is what I would consider a symmetrical balance. It's very uniform in that, but it's not super evenly planted. So the real risk when you get into these super symmetrical mirror image kind of balance situations is if you lose one thing, you pretty much lose them both. And I liked how Daniel talked about, being realistic with your client. I think Helen talked about it some this morning too, like, here's what it's going to mean. So in this example, this one is, I like this one. It's not bad. It is very mirror-like, but they did use like these hydrangeas that aren't super formal and trimmed to exactly the same shape. So, there's not an expectation of them looking exactly the same, but when this boxwood dies, this one's got to go because you're not going to buy another one that looks just like that. So that's always the risk you run into with these super symmetrical gardens is if you lose one side, you're probably going to have to replace it all. I picked this picture as kind of an example because even though there's a lot going on in this, I would say it's pretty balanced as far as what I was talking about with the weight, your heights, both sides of this walk kind of tier up. There's a lot going on here, but I think it's a pretty balanced design and that you don't feel like everything's on one side and there's nothing on the other. So our third principle we're going to look at, contrast and harmony. And we're talking about standing out and blending in. So contrasting elements are things that we use to draw attention to a part of the garden. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can do this with color combinations. You can do it with forms. You can do it with textures. It's a great way to draw interest to a particular part of the garden, but you do want to be cautious with this because too much will really make things very chaotic. You don't want too many contrasts happening at one time, or it can be too much. Harmony is achieved through repetition and balance, and this is what helps create your flow. So this is where we're actually trying to find similar elements, work with the same kind of colors, the same textures, the same forms to bring things together and make it a more uniform design. So for example, this is a really neat one here, and you can try this out and I guarantee you it'll work. When your eye catches the combination of this kind of chartreusey bright yellow and purple, your brain will make you look at it. You don't have a choice. It's just so striking that you pretty much have to look at it. Down here is an example of kind of a flat and natural area with suddenly these round spheres. So that's a kind of more of a form and form contrast. A natural setting and a very flat setting with suddenly these big round things. And then here's a little more harmonious look with some purples and silvers and blues that work together well. Continuing this idea, some contrasts, this really fine foliage of this, I think it's a small pine or something along those lines with this big melianthus behind it. So a real strong contrast in the foliar styles. I really love this picture. You've got this very vertical element with the grasses, but then these little, tufts of balls kind of floating out there in the air gives you a nice contrast there. And then that kind of repeats with the large ball back here, carrying the spear thing, but then this is very kind of unnatural in a very natural looking setting. So those are some really cool contrasts there. Some more harmonious gardens, again, with whites and silvers and blues, kind of tying everything together. Very similar vertical elements that kind of, even like the vine over here versus the shrubs over here, tying everything together. And then finally, the Japanese garden, which is, I think, probably the greatest, most classical example of a harmonious garden, where everything is very purposeful and everything flows together well and ties together. Color, the spice of the garden, as they say. And, the color is kind of like spices when you're cooking. You can make a soup, you can make a meat dish, you can make a pasta. The spices are really what make it what it's going to be. Color, like spices, are the most used thing in design, and they're probably the most overused element of design. So when I say that you should research color, you're not just looking at, what are complementary colors, what are contrasting colors, but also a lot of colors elicit emotional responses. There's actually a lot of science behind colors. Again, I was talking earlier about how that chartreuse yellow and purple combination, like you have to look at it. Your brain doesn't have a choice. You're always going to look at that. So spend some time and learn about colors and what you can do with them and what they will do when you work with them together. But generally, your warmer colors, your reds, your yellows, your oranges, They're going to tend to jump out. They're going to kind of make themselves in the foreground of everything. You do have to be a little careful with mixing, particularly reds. Some reds don't play together well because some reds lean more towards bluey pink and some lean more towards oranges. So just be cautious about mixing too many of those in one area. Some of your cooler colors, like your blues, greens, light pastels, and purples, they tend to move your eye to the background and add depth to your design. I really like this top picture. Lots of color, a lot of it not achieved through flowers. There's some greens and a lot of yellows and purples that are coming from foliage and things like that. Important to remember that, you know, all parts of the plant provide some kind of color, so keep that in mind. This is a bit much at the bottom for me. That's a lot of color. I think that would be an example of overused color. But here's some other examples. I really like this, the white garden, which is quite a challenge if you ever get that challenge to do a white garden, particularly here in Austin because white flowers fade pretty fast and they don't look great when they're faded. But it is an interesting constraint to have. Of course, remember that pottery can bring color to the garden too. You know, there's so many colors to choose from these days. And then I like this. This really shows you, we got a lot of bright colors here. You have lots of yellows, some oranges, some reds. But then when there are these little pops of purple and the greens, it kind of almost looks like a hole there, even though that plant is at the forefront. It almost makes it look like there's a little more depth to the picture there because of those cooler colors there. Transition. When I talk about transition, I'm not necessarily talking about the transition from, you know, this part of the yard to this part of the yard, but it's more about a sequence of events and how you're planning things, gradual changes in the arrangement so that you can add depth and character and things like that to your landscape. And you can do this with a lot of these same elements we've been talking about. You can do it with plant size, you can do it with color intensity. So, you know, starting with a real bright yellow and working towards a more subtle yellow. You can do it with textures and foliage shape, you know, starting with a real large foliage and going down or vice versa. Typically, you're going to want to start with your big stuff, your trees, the larger shrubs and stuff, and work your way down. And you can use this to create the illusion of depth or to kind of frame a focal point. So, for example, with the pictures here, there's kind of this triangle with these big trees, kind of this larger, you know, medium-sized berm with some shrubs, and then the grass. So it's this triangle that really gives the impression of a lot more depth to this area than there is because of the way it flows up. I like in the second picture, you've got this little tiny boxwood trimmed at maybe 6 inches, and then getting up here, there may be 12 inches, maybe 16 to 18 to 24 inches. You got a shrub back here. So you're kind of repeating this exact same form, but getting larger and larger. So again, you're adding much more depth as you go back with this design. And I've actually seen a scenario like this where the trees were even boxed, trimmed in a box kind of form to carry that even further. So, and just here's some other examples of transition. Using, like in this example, you've got this little dwarf conifer here, some larger conifers here, really bringing the depth and the height as that builds to the back. This is more of a literal transition, but transitioning from the home in the backyard into the woods. I like the way the patio is not, you know, a hard stop, but it just kind of fades out a little bit and then goes into more rocks and natural, and next thing you know, you're in the woods. And then again, repeating some ideas in different sizes to add some depth and character to the garden up here. So, lines. Probably one of the most, I think, one of the more important principles of design is the line. What kind of lines are you going to use? One of the the rule, if you will, of this, follow the regulating line. The regulating line is going to be, you know, there's going to be something in the yard that's going to give you the base. Most often it's the house. It could be a big retaining wall. It could be the fence. But there's almost always something that's going to give you a line to start on. If you want a real challenge, try to design a landscape for a completely flat, barren field. It's almost impossible. because you just don't know where to start. So this regulating line is going to be kind of your basis to know what to start off of. Once you've committed, don't deviate. Now, when I say that, you're not going to design the entire yard around one line, but let's say the front yard, let's design it around the regulating line in the front. The back, let's find the regulating line in the back, so that we can work off of that. Lines can add depth and distance to a garden, pathways and things like that. These are vital, and they generally help define the dominant lines within a yard. And when I say, be committed and don't deviate, like I like the way this kind of diagonal design up here, they actually went off of the dominant line in a perpendicular way. But you can see they've got the paths definitely give some depth to this yard, which is very thin, and they've worked everything off of one dominant line, even though that's kind of strange to the eye. I really like that one. The lines are not always straight, sometimes they're curves, but you'll see that the curves kind of follow, they kind of stick with one another. Sometimes they're going to be very straight lines, sometimes they're going to be straight and round. But find these dominant features and follow that line and work within those confinements, if you will. Proportion and scale. So the size of the elements you're using are the scale, but how these elements to relate to one another are the proportion. Generally, your space is going to dictate your scale. Not always, but generally that's what's going to dictate your scale. Proportion gives you more room to play around with. Everything doesn't have to be a huge thing to make a big impact. You can mass smaller plants to make a larger element. Size definitely does matter. Know where it is now, but also where is it going. I had a nickel for every time I saw where somebody planted a 15-gallon Mexican fan palm in a little garden, and you come back 20 years later and that thing's 20 feet tall and it just looks ridiculous. Know what the plant's going to do, and don't just make it look great when you walk away, but make sure that it's going to last and be the right proportion and the right scale down the line. And then you want to try to create pleasing relationships. There's a lot of relationships that in the mind are very pleasing. Kind of like I was talking about the yellow and purple example. There's just these things that in your brain that make everything feel right. There's one rule that's called the golden rectangle. And it's a ratio of 1 to 1.6, which is a lot to think about. But basically, it works out to about 5 by 8, meaning that something should be just a little deeper than it is wide. So if you had a bed that's 8 feet wide, if you can make it roughly 5 foot deep, and of course, we're never working with perfect rectangles, but if you can get at least one part of it that size, that just looks kind of right to the eye and it feels good. And then particularly the Fibonacci spiral or Fibonacci principle, which is a way of kind of building things up. It's super fascinating if you don't know about it, and it's a really interesting way to help you build a garden and help you build your curves and your sweeps and lines and stuff like that, and even your plants. It's just super pleasing to the brain for whatever reason. So here are some gardens that I think have really, really good scale. You've got these nice big ferns, but they're not too much. You got some trees, but they're not too much. This pot's just the right size in that frame. There are some big elements. There's lots of smaller elements. Everything looks nice and proportioned. This is a garden that was actually designed on the Fibonacci spiral. It kind of starts here with one plant and then a couple, and it builds itself up and spirals around. And it's even bigger on this back side that you can't see. But a really fascinating way and great challenge if you ever want to try to do that for design. One of my last principles is going to be simplicity. If you've never heard the KISS acronym, keep it simple, stupid. It's one of the best principles of all art and design is to just keep things simple. Pick 2 or 3 colors and repeat them. Don't try to get every color in the palette, and the rainbow in the garden. Pick 2 or 3 colors and stick with those. Repeat plants and repeat the combinations. I always encourage, as a designer, minimize decorations. Trust me, as soon as you walk away, your client is going to go out and buy a bunch of tchotchke stuff at the garden shop and put it all over their yard. So you don't need to do that. They're going to do that. Now, I'm not to say that there can't be key elements. If you need like a nice large planter or something like that to be a key element, that's great. But you don't need to be adding these little decorations because your client is going to do that. Again, being consistent with your materials, not mixing a lot of different materials. And then I like this as kind of your guiding principle on this. Elements that do not provide improvement or impact can be omitted. So when you're looking at something, does this thing that I want to do in this yard, does it provide an improvement to the yard? Does it make an impact in the landscape? Or is it just something to be there? If it's just something to be there, then don't use it. So I love this picture. I think this is a great example of unity, balance, great lines. I like everything. I kind of like everything about this picture. Like, this is a really nice, and obviously this isn't a whole landscape, but this is just, to me, illustrates a lot of these principles at work at one time, with repetitions, with different textures and foliage, just all the things that I like. So like that one. Finally, I just throw this kind of note in there. I think that any designer should know what the install is going to entail, even if you're not the person that's going to be doing the install, even if you're just the designer, know what it's going to take to do this. This is just a great quote that I think we should all, as landscape professionals, keep in mind. It's better to plant a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole than a $5 plant in a 50-cent hole, because we all know that that $5 plant in the 50-cent hole is going to die, and we're going to be back replacing it at some point. And that is it. And I would say thank you all very much. Here's my email address. I am with the City of Austin, and I'm over at Zilker Botanical Gardens. So if you ever want to come by and say hey, I encourage you to do that. And I guess, Denise, you'll let me know if we have any questions.
Well, Meredith, you did such an awesome job. There weren't any questions. So thank you. And I really want to give Meredith a special shout out. Merredith has been supporting the Grow Green program for, well, since its existence, which it's going to be 20 next year. So
no way! 20 years?
I was
at the, wow, I was at the very first landscape professional training, which I know that wasn't 20 years ago, but.
No, it was in 2008, but dude, we're getting old. So I'm glad that there are some up and coming folks out there that want to carry on all this awesome stuff. But no, Merredith is awesome and wonderful. He's great to work with. I'm glad that he's working at the city. He's been at, how long have you been at Zilker?
About getting close to 3.5 years now.
Yeah, so if you've been there since then, you've noticed a big difference because of Meredith's magic touch. It used to be a little bit overgrown, and maybe the spaces weren't utilized as well as they could be, and Meredith has come in and done some great work. So we super thank you for that and for helping with Grow Green for all these years. And now we've got you on our side, so not that we didn't before. But just a couple little things. We are going to finish early, so you guys can be excited about that. But I just wanted to say thank you about the design. I wanted to mention you can still use native plants in all those designs. It's more about the arrangement and the hardscape that defines, the character of some of those. And also that horticulture is an art and a science. And that's one thing I love about it, that, a lot of the things he was talking about are art, but then there is the science component and the light and the texture and the form and the color. You think about designing an interior house and you put your couch here and your chair there and you got your clothes and it stays that way. But in landscape, you put it all there and then nature happens and things do well and some don't, and then something dies. So it's just way more interactive as far as art goes. But the best way, I think we all probably already know, and Helen mentioned this, is taking care of plants and growing plants and being out there and seeing how they respond is the best way to learn about this. So I am going to wrap it up. Look at us, 20 minutes early. We thank you guys so much for hanging in there with us. We will be back tomorrow at 8:30. I hope having those 10-minute breaks in between helps it be a little less torturous. And another thanks out to Katie Duffy, awesome Katie, and our other speakers today. Hope you guys have a great afternoon, and we will see you tomorrow.
Hi, everybody.
I thought I had my camera on that whole time. I can't manage my camera and my microphone, but hi, Katie.